Welcome to Modern Mythology, a podcast that explores the many intersections of story and system. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net.
Today we are going to talk about setting, and I loved that when I brought this up, the two of you scratched your heads and you were like, what the hell? And so I want to frame it for you, for everybody. So there's three pieces of the equation that we're talking about in setting. And I also want to remind everybody that what this is all about is how mechanics and story align, right? And in doing the research on this, I really found a couple things, like some truisms, which we'll sort of get into. But the first thing to think about is how much is your setting intertwined or feeding your mechanics, or how your players play? How much are your mechanics feeding into your setting? So mechanics drive setting as compared to setting driving mechanics or driving behavior, right? Because these are all ostensibly player behaviors.
Right, incentivizing or de-incentivizing things.
Right, right. And then the third piece is the idea of agnostic systems, right? An agnostic, right, where
the system's kind of creating a frame for, quote unquote, the world or the reality. And the idea is that it's independent of setting.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I'm glad you brought that up, because in my youth, the first 20 years of my gaming experience, I had always conceived of mechanics as being the physics of your world.
Right. Simulationist element, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, right. And, we're going to talk a little bit when we talk about the other frameworks. We'll talk about simulationism. But the idea that, and I want to kind of set aside that. My opinion has changed. And let me point out.
I mean, physics is also probably not the right term necessarily for
I think it
what
is.
you're talking
Well,
about.
what's how
mentally, I think people think about it that way sometimes, even though it's
it's more the simulation of realism, right? So how realistic is the system to real world physics?
No, I actually do mean physics. I get what you're saying, and this is why I'm making a distinction, because it literally was where I was going, was the idea that if you think about mechanics as physics, i.e. realism, right? Then what happens is you're constantly chasing this nearly unattainable concept.
Right.
And that was one of the reasons why I love these crunchy systems, why I loved Rollmaster, why I love Phoenix Command, why I loved these games that their physics engines were so complex. There is a game that I love called Time Masters, if I remember correctly.
I'm just laughing at the name.
It was by a company called BTRC, BlackRock Tactical Research Center, who ostensibly, it's a very fancy name for one designer, Greg Porter, who I absolutely adore his approach. There's so many really good games that he designed. And he is famous for a supplement he wrote called Guns, Guns, Guns. And he crossed several different systems and applied ballistic logic.
That's interesting. You're going to where I was thinking,
to each of these systems.
If you want to make physics, put a velocity on arrows and drawing the bow.
So I've mentioned Phoenix Command in the past, and Phoenix Command is notorious because what you did is you literally tracked the velocity of the round until it stopped. And you had
great.
you had various armors that that slowed it down. You also had bodies that slowed it down. So you actually had a differentiation between tumbler rounds, which is what the M16 was known for, compared to the AK-47, which was a steel-jacketed, round that usually just went through. A tumbler round would go in and would flip around inside your body and generally do a lot more damage, where the AK would just jettison through. And it emulated this, and to the point where where does the bullet stop? And that becomes really fascinating and interesting, because sometimes cover was just how much it slows the round down, and could a certain round go through the wall to hit you, and then if you're holding people up as cover or anybody gets in the way, does it go through them?
Good strategy. Good strategy. I recommend it.
This brings up a topic I've been thinking about a lot lately, but
and so it gets you to some kind of crazy places. I hope everybody who's listening understands. And then the funny thing is, the flip side of this is Greg then comes to say, down the line, a famous quote of his was like, all right, I'm going to give you realistic mechanics for a firearm. If you get shot, flip a coin. Heads you live, tails you die.
Right. From a clinical perspective, it's like heads you don't hit a major artery, and tails you do,
or infection. There's a number of things that lead you down that primrose path. I just watched Death by Lightning. It's about Garfield's assassination.
Oh, right, yeah. I saw it too. I was like, wait, I knew that. Yeah, okay.
And it was really good. It was real.
It was.
Some fantastic people in there. Spoiler alert, Garfield dies from sepsis.
I definitely want to check that out.
You should. It's on Netflix.
There's a lot of good actors in it.
Oh, so good. But anyway, my point is, so it started to dawn on me that mechanics can't be about physics. And eventually I took this leap, and you guys will have heard me use this example many, many times, because I think it is the quintessential example between what I would call traditional play, which is a simulationist, physics-based idea of gaming, compared to narrative play, and that is climbing a wall.
Yeah, you do like that one.
Right. In simulationist play, the wall has a surface area, it has a height, you have a skill, you have equipment, those collide to create some sort of realistic, in case your audience doesn't hear the heavy air quotes, the realistic idea of how hard would it be, what percentage chance do I have to get over
based on your musculature
this wall. Right, exactly.
And I have to call out that leads to the challenge of automatic successes and critical failures in D&D, the arguments that are made about the chance that this will happen is either next to nothing or certain, but here you're introducing at least
a 5% chance
one way or the other, something impossible happens no matter what,
which is actually,
or something really easy fails.
It's actually interesting in a narrative sense, though, which kind of makes it kind of go full circle. Because I don't know if it's the best way of doing it, but when you're around the table, you want that 5% chance of the thing that's really actually incredibly unlikely to happen, right?
Cool.
Right, exactly.
Cool. So let me finish real quick.
Go ahead.
So first you have, what's the percentage chance of climbing over the wall? But then there was something clicked in my brain, and it became, what are your stakes? What is actually, it's not a matter of whether or not you get over the wall. It's a matter of why are you trying to get over the wall? And the perfect example is, I'm trying to save my boyfriend, right? And then that role is about whether or not you get over in time to save your boyfriend. It doesn't have to do with whether or not you get over the wall. It's whether or not you get over in time to meet your stakes. And then every role then becomes to that narrative point. And
you've introduced me to consequence,
right,
which comes up a lot. And prior to us talking about this, in this, for me, that wasn't a thing. But that's the opposite of that. Like, what are the consequences if you don't get over the wall and you don't save your boyfriend?
Or you succeed, but something happens that makes maybe your intention get subverted or whatever.
Right. Do you get over in time, but you hurt yourself, right? Yada, yada, yada. And then when you frame it that way, then you lose a lot of the necessity. There's, quite honestly, there's probably too many variables then. Like, what are you going to do? Like time, how long it takes for the villain's knife to come across the throat or whatever the case is. Like, that's not how things work in film, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of what...
You're simulating a film, simulating a book. Not simulating
I will argue that it works if you're measuring it in 6-second increments. Very slowly.
6-second increments.
Over an 8-hour session.
One thing I wanted to mention, it's related to this. I don't know if it's exactly a talk, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I think you've mentioned it before too, which is like in a fight, in like a movie where there's a fight going on, right? It can be fun to see these two really like incredibly competent people trading off blows, but they're blocking, they're moving out of the way. But in a game system sense, nothing is happening. And whenever we try to simulate that in a game, it's frustrating. You're like, I missed. He blocks it.
And even if you put some flavor text to that, it still gets repetitive.
Yeah, but it's like that's one of the challenges. You're trying to create this experience of that sort of fight. A lot of times, those sort of, if it's not a fight, it's, this person against that person or this, whatever it is, and like it's, a lot of times the experience of playing it, of running the game could be very different from what you're trying to get at, and that's...
Yeah, interestingly enough, like just as a good example of that is we talked a little bit about my inclinations in gaming and how I've had to break myself of these habits, because it's that kind of gameplay that I used to pursue.
Right.
I used to pursue turtling. I used to pursue denial. When I ran Magic or L5R decks, they were always denial decks. Mm-hmm. Like, just the sheer power of being able to be like, no, all right, I'll let you do that. Or no, I don't want you to do that. But that's terribly frustrating for players, right? And so I realized through those experiences that you can't do that because it's frustrating, even though it's appropriate within a setting, even though it's appropriate within physics of nothing happened, right? You can't have deductive mechanics. You really need additive mechanics that just, it's a matter of who adds more and not really about who stops.
Right.
It becomes a big piece of like the burning wheel idea of you're not in disposition. We talk about torchbearer, we talk about, burning wheel. In disposition, you're never increasing your disposition. You're only reducing disposition, or you're slowing down the reduction of disposition. But that disposition's always creeping towards zero.
You want to explain disposition just for people who haven't listened?
Yeah, so in Burning Wheel and Torchbearer and Mouse Guard, the idea is that both groups develop these pools of points. By the way, there's a lot of games like this, milestones in Story Path System, and I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there's a ton of them. And the idea is that you have these pools, and then instead of one person against one person, you have generally teams against teams where people are then trying to manipulate each other's disposition pools. And it's interesting because you get this situation where you're either trying to reduce each other's disposition or slow your own disposition from going down, or some meta-narrative piece like maneuvers where you're giving yourself an advantage or something out here that's going to affect future rolls or something like that. to one of the other two, benefits. So, but you'll note in a lot of these, again, there's no clocks, but you'll note in like Blades in the Dark and Apocalypse, Powered by the Apocalypse games, clocks don't ever go backwards, right? They only go forward or not at all, right? Or slow, right? And that becomes really important because of what you're saying. Like, there has to be some feeling of progress.
Yeah. It's funny because it can be just a psychological thing. Because, like, if it's like a tug of war thing and you're kind of moving the thing back and forth, you're still tracking the same thing ultimately.
100%. Yeah. But it feels different. My opponents hated life playing L5R, Legend of Five Rings against me, as compared to other games that didn't have those mechanics, where they felt like they were doing something.
Right, sure.
But we're pointing this sort of stuff out because that's an example of of this idea of like the physics and realism, and it's this shift between simulationism and new simulationism. So just Jamie, you talked about this in your article.
The rules article. Yeah.
Do you want to sort of spin off so it's not just me?
Okay. Well, go on. You talk about like the sort of like verisimilitude idea, like where you basically like you're trying to simulate a sense of groundedness in like the believability of the story rather than believability of like, the speed of the bullet kind of thing.
Or believability or it's new simulationism is talking about feeding the needs of the setting, not making the setting more realistic.
Right. But like it's kind of like going back to that old rule of like writing fantasy, where it's like if you define a rule in the world, you stick to it. You create that, because like even though it's fantasy, if it changes, it can change, but there has to be a reason why it changed. And like it's the same sort of thing. And I find I get thrown out of RPGs if like something gets like kind of contradicts what we know about the world. I mean, this is an example I've used before. It's kind of silly, but it's a good example of it. Where like we were fighting this dragon in D&D, we had hatched this whole plan, and part of the plan hinged on the fact that this dragon, it can't possibly be like with its wings outstretched, can't be wider than a 30-foot tunnel or whatever it was.
Right, so it couldn't fly down.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But then by the rules, it's like the size of the token is the size of the creature, and if it can fit, it can fly. So we're like, and that just kind of like broke.
I would also argue it's magical flight. It doesn't depend on the
but like it's still
aerodynamics of the wings of the dragon. It's kind of like the fly spell.
It just kind of hovers and
I'm gonna rules monger you. The other example this brings to mind too is when we were trading off DMs, and maybe in our session 0. So maybe Scott, you weren't there, but I tried to impart that idea, and it was from the old simulation idea of like, as you're DMing, if you come up with a rule, that becomes the rule that the subsequent DMs need to follow, which is interesting, but we kind of got into a back and forth about time travel.
Right.
To your point about the clock moving forward, because we had very different ideas about maybe how time travel
whether
would
it's
impact the
or
world.
not, whether there's a consistency between the different timelines and that sort of thing.
But my point is that we were trying to kind of like layer these rules and and it maybe didn't work out that well.
because different methods of time travel could conceivably produce different results.
Yeah,
right?
very much.
Different wormholes could have different physics, quite honestly. Like, even though they're eternally consistent, those would be different, and therefore you could, interact differently with
one could change the future, and one would have always been sort of present.
Right.
Yeah. There you go.
So what I want to do in this conversation is remove that conversation from setting. Okay. I want to remove the idea of rules as physics, right?
Okay.
And the reason is because once you start down that path, what happens is that every rule, absolutely every rule, then informs setting. And that's not quite what we're talking about, right?
That's true. Yeah.
I mean, it's fair. First off, let's think about implicit rules, right? Just exactly what you were saying, Sean. I now, because of a rule of criticals on a 20, I now have a 5% chance of accomplishing absolutely fucking anything, right? Assuming your GM isn't just saying,
that way, yeah.
you can't do that.
Right. But even like you're stabbing with a sword, any particular thing.
Right.
And, argue that just the idea that you're stabbing something with a sword should have very different consequences than what it ends up being in
Absolutely.
5e. But to that point, that might be not impossible, but really, is it a 5% likelihood?
Well, stabbing with a sword is a weird example because the idea of a critical for that is, for lack of a better term, realistic. It's because maybe you nicked an artery. Maybe you're right. Like it's that 50-50 shot, right? But when we're talking about like getting over the wall, right? And if you're at the table, you're like, I want to get over this 100-foot wall, right? And just run. What are my chances? Well, your chances are 0. No, they're 5%. If I roll a 20,
it depends on how people rule. Because a lot of people say, if it's not possible, then you can't make the roll. Other people will set the DC so high that there's a lot of different.
Right. But it also, like, as we look into like Powered by the Apocalypse and stuff like that. Not to say that a GM can't say no, but one of the big credos to narrative play is say yes or roll the dice. So there is no in say yes or roll the dice, right?
Oh, I like that.
And thus your players start to be like just shooting for the moon if they're smart. You know what I mean? And really wily Burning Wheel character players for Duel of Wits, they'll like set their arguments so high. I want you to think I'm a god, right? Because there's compromise, right? So then the idea is like, okay, well, if I get halfway through your disposition, you're at least going to like me. And maybe that's my point, is I want you to like me,
Yeah.
So you have to be really obviously pretty careful, and so, yeah. So anyway, so I just want to remove the idea of system as physics off the table. We understand that if you have a linear system as compared to like GURPS or for God's sake, Hero, which is a curve or a plateau, right? Dipole systems flatten out that are curved, rather, increase the curve, but the more dice you roll flattens it out, but it becomes this weird plateau, right? Where D20, it's a line, right? And the idea of advantage and disadvantage doesn't really change that line that much. It pulls in the ends, is what it does. So we understand that's the case. Those nuances do affect your setting, which we'll talk about a little bit. But once you include that, the whole conversation becomes a paper tiger. Because then nobody can argue, oh, by the way, the system is in fact affecting my setting. System is always affecting my setting.
So how we want to define setting is basically like the world it's happening in and our assumptions about that world kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we hit upon something in our conversation just before we came on, is the idea that there's this interesting conflation of terms that happens in some people's minds. And that is the conflation of setting and narrative. That you have the idea of, here are rules, and here is the color. Here's fluff.
And just fluff. The story becomes fluff.
And like, think about it. How often, I don't know about you guys, I know I have done this in the past. I used to open usually a 3rd edition book and open it up and look for the feat. Or look for the new class. And what's that going to look like? And I'm going to White Wolf books. I generally read them cover to cover, but when I first opened them, I ignored the first 15 pages of those motherfuckers because there's always some short story
at the
there.
beginning. Yeah. I have to admit, same here. I went back and read them later, but
I went back and read them later, but I went to what are my new disciplines, and stuff like that. What are the new creatures? That kind of stuff.
Well, I was going to say, how much is setting then the characters too? Because obviously, in a fantasy setting, the characters are going to have certain, tropes or types, and so would you include characters then in the setting as well? Like, because to your point, like the characters to some extent are the abilities, like I would hear people describe like the reason why the players are there is to use the things that are on the piece of paper, right? Like they want to use the stuff, the feats, in the one hand, but how much of that is setting? Because to your point, the feats are just another set of rules,
right?
Yeah.
So I think this brings us to let's start from the last piece that we were considering, right? The first piece being mechanics feeding setting, the second piece being setting feeding mechanics, and the third one being system agnostics, right? Mm-hmm. A system agnostic of setting, right? And so let's talk about that, right? Because that's that piece. That's your GURPS. Mm-hmm. GURPS. Fate. What are some of the other ones?
In a way, Cypher is
Cypher.
It is agnostic, even though it's definitely like a story game. It is setting agnostic, so that's kind of an interesting.
Yeah. Let's see here. Hold on one sec. There was a couple that we were looking at. Savage Worlds is a good one. Basic role playing. Now, basic role-playing, some of these systems, Hero System's a big one. Daggerheart. Daggerheart's interesting. We're going to talk about Daggerheart because Daggerheart's core rule system, I could understand why a system-agnostic player or GM would approach Daggerheart and ignore campaign frames, which you'll talk about later,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to applying that, especially as we talk about this as a learned
and be like, okay, what, I think for in the 3.0 days where D20 was approached as a system agnostic sort of thing, that you could just approach this idea. Right.
I played some of that, or ran some games, like Modern D20 or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Modern, exactly. So to answer your question, like characters, how you made characters definitely informs setting to some degree. But I don't know, I'm interested in what you guys think, because on one hand, I would say certain games inform setting by making characters more than others. But you're right. As soon as you open the player's handbook, I have a wizard, I have a sorcerer, I have a warlock. Warlock says there are things that give me power, just like clerics, right? These are all pretty setting shaking things.
Sure. I mean, I would say that character is a part of the setting by being a part of the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the way people think about or interact with their character is in the setting, and that's kind of like, I don't know. I'm trying to think about how you distinguish that between the rules, like you're talking about.
Well, I think to some extent the setting then determines some of the limitations of the characters, right? Of the those different roles. If you think about clerics, you mentioned clerics in different settings. Are very much distinguish what you can and can't do. Again, going back to the D&D settings, we talked about, a cleric is very different in Dragonlance, and a wizard is very different in Dark Sun. Right. Where the setting then is determining a lot of what there's those.
Right. It definitely supports the assumptions that you have. I think assumptions is a big word for me with setting. I feel like because tropes certainly, but also just like, how does magic work in this world? Is it fancy? Is it some other kind? Those things affect the system in some ways, but like it's even more than that. It's kind of like what you have to learn versus what you can just kind of like roll with, and that can be, a sticking point sometimes if it's like you're thrown into a setting where you don't really have any familiarity with the setting. Like you're playing Star Trek and you've never seen a Star Trek movie or show before. All your friends have, they're playing it. You can work in that by being the alien, literally, and kind of roll with that. But like, not knowing those things to assume you don't know what you're missing. You don't know what you are kind of what's on or off the board.
Yeah, I think that's actually pretty interesting, because if you think about, that's a really good example, because you could. I'm trying to think, like, how would a Star Trek versus a Star Wars character sheet look? And I think that will very much depend on the system that you play it in, because I don't think those characters would look different in GURPS or Fate especially. I don't think if you were to make Fate characters for those two settings, that they would look very different.
Like different words. One would be called Greedo or whatever.
Well, aliens is aliens. When they all have aliens, they both have aliens, and they both have unhuman-looking aliens, and so on and so forth. The only difference is that some people might say something like Savage Worlds would be a better setting for Star Wars, where GURPS or something a little more grounded might be a better setting for Star Trek. Star Trek, while they're both fantastic and both heroic and a lot of levels, Star Trek characters don't do flips in the air and move things with their minds generally. Right. Where that's pretty commonplace in Star
no
Wars.
magic, right? Talk about that and settings.
So you could, I think, if you had watched Star Wars and sat down in a GURPS game, right, of Star Trek, you could play Star Trek as, like, thinking about Star Wars. Like, you would approach that game based on how you relate to.
Right.
We talked a little while ago about my experience with HeroQuest and how, like, the GM framed these people with, like, swords and shields and, like, marching, and they had this very narrow framework of what they could do within this setting. And because I had played RuneQuest before, I knew you were capable of crazy dramatic shit, and I did crazy dramatic shit, and the rules supported me.
Right.
But their perception, right? The rules, because it's agnostic.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean by assumptions.
Yeah. It's interesting because, like, I think Burning Wheel's character creation very much informs the setting.
Yeah.
Where I don't find D&D informs the setting. And I think yes, you're right. There are wizards. There are clerics.
There are some of those exceptions.
Right.
Yeah.
We're heroes, right? We get that. And that's what I'm trying to filter out, right? Because you can use those same D&D rules to play wildly different kinds of fantasy games. And in the case of 3.0, we saw so many rule sets that were trying to be just stripped down D20 to just be D20. And that's where Green Ronin had warrior, adept, and expert. Those were the classes, kind of idea. Leveling systems definitely sort of change the way you view the world and advancement compared to basic role play, right? And basic role play is much harder. Your statistics are much more grounded. It's percentage based. But also remember that, like, D20 was born of D&D. Basic role play was born of RuneQuest and Call of Cthulhu. Hero was born of Champions. Like, it's interesting that these system agnostic games that towards the 90s, I think you were mentioning this in your articles, were going towards this universalism. But playing a game of Hero and playing a game of basic RPG are two very different experiences,
So what part of this? There's so many pieces of this conversation that it's hard to know which one to move on to next.
Sure, no. So let's, since we're talking about setting Gnosticism, let's just talk about some of the arguments against it, right? I wanted to sort of spin off of you guys and what you think. Some of the things that I've heard argument-wise is stuff like mechanical gameplay is more interesting than setting and story.
I can say there's some players that are there for that.
Right.
Right? I mean, if you think about the board game, or just game aspect of it, like there's a lot of players
I've made a choice
that
do
sit
that.
down and they're just there for the mechanics of the combat.
Like I can definitely look at the style of play that like I've gotten into before, but it's for me I have to make a very conscious decision that like this is what we're doing, this is why we're playing this game, and kind of keep the other stuff out of my head, But it can be a way of going about it, but it does create a very different experience for me as a player, because maybe it's because I'm usually doing it with miniatures, but it's very much more like playing a game in a way, where the role play part of it is less. It kind of falls in the background.
You're setting up a puzzle or a challenge of sorts on that. Yeah.
Is there a left brain, right brain thing at play here too?
Maybe, I don't know.
Is it some people might be more attuned to the mathematical and the reasoning and the logic puzzle that's going on with mechanical play compared to a creative approach?
Yeah, and to be totally honest, like that, long-winded battle for me as a dungeon master, game master, it gets to be too long, and I want to get back to the narrative and the story and descriptions of the setting and move the story along. So yeah, I think definitely at some point you get to the point where you're just trying to get past it to to start getting into the role
fast
playing.
forward on the combat.
Yeah, but and engaging them in role playing. But then there's those players there that are also there that are like not going to engage in just the conversation. So then it becomes the group that's willing to do the RPG.
I'll be the first person to admit that as story and performance focused as I've been, when I sat down to play D&D, I sat down to level. That
element of your kind of grindy past comes to the fore, and you're like, all right, I'm going to figure out the system and beat it.
100% how I approached this logic problem. I wasn't trying to be creative. I wasn't trying to tell a story. I was trying to show how good I was at the system. It was at the core of gamism.
Right.
So we could sort of see where some of those people, again, the importance of creative agendas, right? Where some of those people would be really frustrated by rules that kind of force them to engage in the setting.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you could say it the other way around of if you have a rule set that is more entwined with the setting, then everybody is more on the same page with their gamism. I can sit and approach my very gamist, reason, logic-based way of approaching.
That's why I like running wheels so much.
That's why I love running wheels so much. Is that I can be crunchy and it tells a good story. Right?
Yeah.
And is probably informing the setting. What was the other one that I found was GMs who, again, opened the book and flipped to the crunchy bits. Because when system and setting and mechanics are so intertwined, it makes it harder for them to separate these out for their own worlds.
Yeah.
Right? So if your setting does not jive with a particular mechanic, and that mechanic is endemic to your setting, you have a problem. Is one of the big problems with 4.0. Right, at 4th edition, was they had made how everything worked in the background more opaque, and everything was set up to be very balanced and setting agnostic by and large. So it was much harder for people to make it theirs.
Right. and get away from all of the crunchiness.
Right.
That was a big complaint, I think, from 40.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Because I'm preparing to run Daggerheart.
Yeah.
So, and the way you're saying this just brings up, what I don't know about Daggerheart as I'm preparing. But I also have a very ambitious setting that I want to apply to it.
Fun.
So, what would you say I should be looking out for as it pertains to Daggerheart in terms of how much, once I get into the mechanics, like I said, I don't know a lot about it yet.
Yeah.
How would that apply here? Like, how successful am I going to be at starting with the setting and having, an idea in mind, and then going back and going, oh, wait a minute, this might not be applicable.
Sure. I mean, Daggerheart has kind of a very specific piece that could feed into setting, which is domains. I think domains are, other than the campaign frames, right? We're ignoring the campaign frames because campaign frames turn it all around and say, by the way, you're part of this world, right? Heritages are a good example of really do inform the setting. Once you get animal people and fungi people and turtle people and
as long as it becomes an actual part of the character. I mean, there can be the element of it where it's sort of like, or the one heritage or the other, or one species or whatever it is in the game, or the other. It's just sort of a cosmetic difference.
It's cosmetic difference, right? Absolutely. That's where some of those systems, wipe out that stuff,
right? Or
will wipe out the idea. Quite honestly, you have some story games that do that also. If you think about dogs, right? Dogs in the Vineyard, all of your stats are just words. And all of you could be like, I trudge forward and smite someone. I talk very low tones with people. As compared to, I jump in the air and shoot shit, the way you intone those things flattens out those differences within the setting.
Right.
It's interesting how the book does a good job in suggesting the tone of your traits.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Can I give a confession here?
Yeah.
This is related to this, but something I haven't talked a lot about. But, my first RPG games that I played were not D&D. They were elementary, a bunch of elementary kids getting together and drawing pictures and then doing a literal maze and describing as you go through and face off against monsters. The confession I have is around 8th grade, I had a friend that was still playing that way as I was getting into D&D, and regret that I kind of burned that relationship in part because it was a good friend of mine, but he wanted to just take a character and have it be the Marvel superhero that couldn't be hit.
Right.
And I'm like, well, that's not how D&D works. Sorry.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's not going to work here.
Yeah.
And we stopped being friends, which is a huge regret that I have. I have very few regrets in life, but that was one. And, and obviously maybe that wasn't the only reason, but that was my introduction. And it was funny because that was always sort of I'm thinking about playing those games and was like, oh man, I was so, ill-informed in terms of what the game
I didn't know what the rules were.
And you're just bringing that full circle and going, that is a way that you can play that really makes up great stories. And it's funny because I go back to some of those stories and think about the drawings and maybe what few I still have around. And even my, brothers and others would say, oh, remember that character that we made back then? It's like, oh yeah, when we were not playing to the rules. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. One of my first characters was a halfling that was 6'5".
Halfway.
Yeah, no.
I don't even remember why it was so important to me that I was halfling. I really don't remember, but
Definitely a thing in D&D.
yeah.
The element of creating I'm also guilty of this for a period of time. A lot of arguments online on forums of this isn't the proper ruling of that. You go to Sage Advice number whatever.
Written versus rules as intended.
Yeah. I think the sort of legalese
I don't know how many
debate,
times especially more recently, searched raw in the moment. I'm one who likes pulling out the book and going through it as we're playing.
I used to be.
Yeah. It creates like a sense of like there being a sort of stability. And I think this does actually get back to what we're talking about, because it creates a sense of stability in the world, I think. Mm-hmm. But, maybe through, like you're saying, through rules that don't necessarily apply to the set of settings. So it can be a little confused or a little confusing.
Right. So to go back to your question about Daggerheart.
Yeah.
I need help.
Hope and fear are the big pieces to the equation. Mm-hmm. And there's been some conversation, and I will tell the people who disagree with this sentiment that they are wrong, that this is how you manage hope and fear. Because I think it's a little squidgy in the book. Mm-hmm. Think of it in terms of consequences, right? And like, so the player gets to narrate some advantage if you roll hope. If you fail, it's fail with advantage, You can
also store them to use for like special powers.
Yeah, there's special powers. I'm not talking about that stuff, but yes, you're right. But that's the advantage. The advantage is I get to use my special thing even though I failed.
Right.
Fear is a negative consequence, and you should always refer to that as damage. Now, it doesn't have to be threshold damage, but it is damage. Right? And a lot of people think, oh no, you're just failing and framing it in a better way, or failing and framing it in
you get a meaner flavor text.
Yeah, and like, they were like, well, we would, no. Right. Hope is the player gets a little something. Fear is the GM gets a little something. And I always think about that in terms of like, Blades, and we've been playing a lot of Cyber plus Punk and Echoes of the Veil, where you look at it as like effect and threat as damage, right? So a minor consequence would be a little bit of damage.
I also kind of think of it as like and or but, like in this sort of old like
improv,
improv thing, where it's like yes and or yes but.
100%. It's not just this narrative, we frame it differently. No, you need to think of it as hope is positive consequences, fear is negative consequences, and people should feel that mechanically.
Right. And the cool thing about it is you can succeed but get fear. So that's like that throws the sort of assumption with D&D out, where it's like success is success, failure is failure. Right. That's it.
Yeah. I mean, ever since I played Powered by the Apocalypse, like this idea of partial successes is just ingrained in how I want to run things. And I actually, I'll be the first to admit, like there's an interesting missing piece of Burning Wheel that I learned, oddly enough, by playing Storypath, which is complications.
Complications, right, yeah.
And the idea that I love this idea mechanically that you have complications that you have to buy off, and you can succeed at the roll but still get complications, or you could buy off the complications and fail.
Right.
Which I absolutely like.
Like you succeed, but then people are following you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So does that help?
It does, only because we've done it.
Right.
In the the sci-fi series. But when you were first describing that, what was happening, I was very much lost, or I was very much worried that I was doing the wrong thing. I wasn't lost, but I was like, wait a minute, it sounds bad no matter what.
Right.
Maybe it was, but
yeah.
It's always just like, I don't know. I think I tend to be in this sort of mode of like, a little bad always makes good narrative. Like it's,
that's true. You don't have a story where everything goes
often, although
it's
always you can, but usually you're setting people up for the fall later if you do.
Yeah, I had an old GM that said something appropriate, and it was like, this is not a story about the meteoric rise of the characters. That's not what's going on here,
setting expectations.
Right. Like, and like I'm going to do everything I can to like avoid those pitfalls as a player, mechanically, right? Get around everything and so on and so forth, and be like, no, there has to be some challenge. There has to be some consequence. There has to be some piece of it. That's where you get in weird places for stuff like Powered by the Apocalypse, because you're like, well, as long as I get a +6 to this thing, I'll always succeed and I'll almost never get bad things.
And a lot of times players can resist that, but there can be sometimes surprisingly easy ways to get around it. Well, actually, I'll use an example from our other escape game I think worked really well, where I'm playing this, cyborg who's like, when they go into like killer mode, I don't want to like roll a failure and have it be like, and they miss, or like, and then they fail at that thing, because that's like, they're really good at that, but it can be a thing where it's like, I don't want to kill the person I'm talking to right now. Like, we're having a conversation with someone, trying to get information out of them, but not by like interrogating, just talking to them. Something triggers it. I succeeded too well.
Yeah, right.
Any situation where a character's really good at something, they can succeed at that. Player wants to succeed at their character being really good at doing flips or whatever it is. Great. That doesn't necessarily mean that things turn out great in the whole story, So you can give players what they want, because players don't like to have the character just fall on their face all the time.
Failing forward narratively,
Yeah.
Very interesting. Simulationism, terrible. Right? Like, people hate the idea of failing forward. And a lot of GMs really hold on to this idea of, I'm making it hard, it's a trudge, blah, blah, blah. We see all these things online of like players who know the rules so well that they like pull all of this stuff out of their ass.
Max, yeah.
And the GM, it like really feels defeated. So I think some of these games give a lot more creative control, while at the same time pulling in the efforts for min-maxing, pulling in, allowing the GM, quite honestly. It's like when you just play by the rules, right? So we haven't really talked a lot about this, but there is this push and pull between, and I don't want to go too much into it because it strays from our topic,
Sure.
But it is important, is who has agency.
Yeah.
And does the game GM fronted? Is it player fronted, or is it rule fronted? And that becomes very important, because a lot of times we'll play games that are rule fronted because the other two sides, quite honestly, aren't being fair. Like, if you have me as the player, right, then I'm going to use the rules to my advantage to the detriment of the story or the game.
Whereas I'll give my character cancer.
Where you have some GMs who this is a power trip, and they don't care or don't recognize the effects that they have on the narrative and the story in a negative fashion, that they're turning their players off. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the games that we play, I tend to be very rules focused, because they're the arbiter to this process. And I don't want the GM to have all the power, and I don't want the players to have all the power. I want the system to drive the story, right, and the game.
I'm gonna say something that's gonna drive you crazy, but it's also is the DM rolling the dice behind the shield or not?
Right.
And it's a level 0 or it's a session 0 thing that I go over. I'm like, look, guys, I can roll behind the shield, or if you want, every roll is out in front and we all see it, and consequences be damned.
The funny thing is, I found a lot of players want you to roll private rolls.
Oh yeah, because they realize
the immersion people will be
and I have to admit, totally, this is absolutely me. My games, I do try and make my characters as heroic and successful as possible. At least those are the games that I really enjoy. Yeah. I also play with a lot of first time players, so I'm also just trying not to slash them.
Sure, and like the stereotypical D&D style fantasy is a hero story, or supposedly is, like that's the idea, and usually heroes.
Well, that's why like Dragonlance is my favorite setting, right? And it's because that it's very much geared towards that, right?
I mean, it's like a really interesting thought experiment of, could Luke die? Could, Yes, Star Wars is already heroic. Star Wars is already Savage Worlds.
Right.
It's
I mean, the hero
not
cycle,
GURPS.
like literally.
It's hero cycle, right? You can't have a hero cycle if your hero dies unless you're Game of Thrones or To Live and Die in LA, where the character dies but lives on, right, through the rest of the narrative.
Right.
Well, you can do that in Game of Thrones. I mean, I don't know what's the equivalent of that RPG.
You could totally do that in RPG. Annalise is a game about the vampire through the eyes of his victims. You know?
And they're all dying one by one?
No, but the point is you have a character arc. Like
Well, that is actually
right,
you have this idea of a character arc. You have an idea of like this character is present but not present. Never mind the fact that they're not alive. I love these games and talk about mechanics feeding setting. Like I love these games where in Artesia and in Hero Quest or any Glorantha game, when you die, your friends just go on a quest to go get you from the underworld.
No.
You know? Or Wraith, the World's Darkness game, you turn into a Wraith, you just keep playing as you know, a ghost.
Yeah.
I think I mentioned recently I ran a game where I had it was at a con, and I had 2 tables. And one was a table of the living, and one, which they did not know, was a table of the dead. And it wasn't until the game began when someone died in the game of the living, the GM sent them over to this other game at the con,
fun.
right?
Yeah.
And they played a ghost.
Right.
And consequently, there were times when ghosts could be summoned from the living table, and the GM was told that player to go over.
Whatever they were doing.
They got pulled away from what was going on.
That is awesome.
And,
That's great.
And came and like people started asking them questions.
Right.
They were like, yeah, I seem to remember that. Right? And
They
like,
can ask questions relevant to the story because
Right,
they find it out.
right.
It's
Like how much does that inform your setting? You
Yeah.
know?
Plus, you can also have death as a sort of like, instead of, I mean, it can be like a literal death, but also like any sort of major transformation for the character that, you know, completely changes sort of, or makes a major change of who they are can be.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
I think Otherscape has like mentioned as one of the possibilities for like sort of their death, quote unquote, condition is you can just be
right.
you know, fundamentally changed by the experience.
By the experience. I had this infamous character that I played that, again, I played very mechanically, you know, and the game be damned. Now, as a sidebar, I did warn my GM. I was like, look, I think this combination of things is broken and you may want to fix it. But the GM was very much, no, I trust the designers. Right? And I dominated.
You did warn me the first time that I was your DM.
Right.
Player character. You did give me a heads up.
Yeah.
I
didn't know what you meant at the time.
The game, and this is a bunch of friends that had not known my past. And when I started playing story games, and I would then go to cons, and instead of the D&D tables, I started going to the games on demand and the story game tables and such. Well, one of my friends decided to run D&D, but they were story gamers running D&D. And at the end, I just like ran shipshot across like this game. And we're like, what did I learn from this? I learned that Scott knows Dungeons and Dragons very well, which I wouldn't have expected coming from where the stances I normally take.
Right.
Most people, when they hear my diatribes about like pro story games, they don't understand that it's from like the trauma that I've inflicted on other people and how much rules affect my brain state, right? And it become important. So we've talked about mechanic agnosticism, probably more than you guys expected us to. Now let's talk about how mechanics affect setting, right? How mechanics inform setting. Some of this is what you're talking about. Just making a character is telling you there's magic in the world, right? I think it's a quarter of the fucking player's handbook is spells.
Spells, yeah.
Well, I mean, clerics and warlocks, right?
Yeah.
There's gods in the world. There's
crazy things.
Some power that's giving you
Warlocks
power.
really change the way you think about that cosmology, quite honestly. Brings it much more real. Clerics, you could be like, well, they're tapping into some energy.
Yeah.
But I think a perfect example of mechanics feeding gameplay, mechanics feeding setting, and mechanics feeding narrative is a death cycle. I think how many hit points, how easy it is to die is a key component to how to behavior.
Yeah.
How easy it is to resurrect.
Players definitely think differently about their characters in D&D based on the fact that you can rest or short rest. And so it sort of makes these cycles of like, how many encounters can I have before I need to do a long
rest? Or that you have a minimum of 3 rounds before you fail 3 death saves.
Well, yeah,
if you go down below your hit point maximum.
Right.
And don't always extend that to the bad guys.
Right. That affects the choices that you make as a player, for sure.
What was the game we just played that, like, if you go up to a person and say, like, hold on there, or something to that effect,
yeah.
and then it stabilizes you?
Was that Mothership?
I think maybe. Was it Mothership?
I can't remember off.
We played it.
Yeah. We played so many games lately.
So many games, it gets confusing.
Well, the other one that comes to mind when you're talking about death is Free Market. Right? I mean, wasn't that the one where we would resurrect?
You die and you just get reprinted.
You just get reprinted, and how much that changed.
Yeah.
That mechanic changed, the motivation of the characters, the storylines that, became really interesting.
Players will look at those books and be like, okay, I can come back.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, Raised Dead is not a very, resurrect and Raised Dead and so on.
Yeah, once you pass a certain level, it's kind of commonplace.
Okay, so we have enough gold, right? Because we're fucking swimming in it. And just, my buddies will just bring me back, I was just saying, it's coming back around to that character that, was dominating the game. I really tried, guys. I really did. Because at one point in time, my character did die before things got really crazy. I did die, and the wizard used a scroll to raise me. And that really informed the rest of the game, because my character basically acted, this is like my new fucking god. Like, this person just brought me back from the dead, So I literally just worshipped the wizard, and I was just a wizard's lackey. That's all I was. I was just like, literally,
that's a funny motivation.
Like that. That's what I did. It reminds me of Amos.
I mean, Lazarus probably didn't be like, oh, all right, never mind, I'm going to go to some other deity.
Amos is that way.
Amos could kill everybody in that show, but found a leader. Right? At first, it was, what's her name?
Naomi.
And then Holton was his star, right?
Somewhat. Yeah, although Naomi was still kind of like his go-to.
So death cycles are a big piece of the equation, how players interact and what the setting is like, if you think about it, like games, just necromancy in its own right.
Yeah.
Really kind of changes. Like, think about the Dungeons and Dragons movie. Right? By far the best scene in that whole film.
Questions.
Yeah.
But I'm not asking you.
And more importantly, why that's important, and yes, it was jokey and funny, because what is that making fun of but the problem inherent in Speak with Dead, which is it kind of negates mystery from your world. It creates this idea of setting where people got away with shit in the past, way more than they do now, because science is not perfect, but they can get pretty far in understanding who did what and why, and cameras, DNA, and
cameras, period.
It's carrying around cell phones. Everybody, it's much harder to get away with stuff than it used to be in the past.
You're saying crimes is what you're saying.
But think about the idea, the intrinsic nature of mystery in narrative, right? Where I'm like, all right, who did it? Who murdered him?
Right.
And then the class goes over and says, hey, buddy, who murdered you? And then, quite honestly, the GM has to like turn and say, oh, well, I didn't see them. My back was to them. And you know what I mean?
I mean, I wouldn't say it removes it, but it's like the sort of thing that it's like it completely changes what the possibilities are of it. You know, like of the mystery. Like, there's still mystery in the world of the person, but you know, a more mechanical version of it. If the fly spell, we've talked about this. Like you design this whole complex thing, and you forget the fact that one of your characters can fly as a fly spell, and they just fly over the thing. You know, and you know.
It's interesting because you have to really think about setting in terms of mechanics, because realistically, there should be no such thing as walls in D&D. No town or castle should ever build walls. I don't mean walls to their house. I mean,
what are you saying?
I mean external walls should not be a thing.
Well, yeah, because people get through them, over them.
Well, creatures fly.
Lots of creatures are
There's
flying.
this teleportation. Like walls are just a non-issue in a Dungeons & Dragons setting, and make it
or high magic one anyway.
economically infeasible. Why are you spending so much time and money and human capital to build fucking walls?
Castle walls and towers and battlements. Yeah,
you know, to just know, like it's so ubiquitous in fantasy.
And why would they be catapults are cheaper than wizards?
Than fireballs, right? Like, but they're. Are they? Or maybe they are.
It depends on the world, but well, exactly. It depends on the world. I mean,
depends on
the setting, or like your setting in D&D.
It depends on your setting, but then I think what was happening was GMs for their settings had to change the rules, and of course, hacking is ubiquitous, and a lot of people are going to argue, well, I don't want setting to inform my mechanics, or vice versa, because we have our own rules. We have our own setting.
Right.
And these rules are not going to fit. Right? Which is why...
That's what I'm worried about with Daggerheart.
When we come back to Daggerheart and the idea of campaign frames, I thought that was really smart. It's like, yeah, it's not exactly setting agnostic, but it makes it where...
Like modular instead of agnostic.
It's more modular instead of agnostic. Like, a lot of people are like, well, CP 2020, Cyberpunk 2020 is a rules agnostic system. I'm like, not really. But, you know, to Mike Pondsmith's credit, they also have a lot of stuff, especially when they did Fusion. Our Telesorian had a system, a rules agnostic system called Fusion. And Fusion, in fact... Artesia uses Fusion, Usagi Yojimbo uses Fusion, Sengoku uses Fusion, and they had very explicitly within the system settings. They called them toggles. You know, like, you turn this on, you turn this off. Like, how do you want the rules to reflect your setting? And, you know,
and support it. Yeah, that makes sense.
These sort of switches, you know, that you could consider. They were considerations, you know. I like campaign frames because, well, yes, domains and heritages and stuff do tell you something about a world if you're going to stick to the rules. Campaign frames drive setting. They make it very clear, oh, by the way, this is a technological setting with all of these assumptions.
Some variety
Here's a Western setting with all of these. Here's a Gothic horror setting with all these assumptions, right? And opens up... players, GMs and players who would argue that they don't want those intertwined. It's the best of both worlds, because you're like, oh, no, I'm going to buy and use Daggerheart and now have my own campaign frame, right? And it's funny because those are the people who are probably arguing against intertwining those things.
Yeah.
You know, why are there walls in D&D, right? Catapults. Would you ever have catapults? Like, what are the rules of warfare? Tolkien magic is very different.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You know?
It's very rarefied in a way, yeah.
You know, so
you wouldn't have as much stuff in the air, but yeah, castles are meant to defend against a land base.
Right. I mean, it's an arms race thing where, the walls are meant to stop something that, and the Mongols come up. That's, always defeats them. Whatever it is.
the Mongols.
Yeah.
Well, like Minas Tirith, that was a huge castle that was built for a land-based attack.
Right. Tiered, right? There's like multiple walls.
Tiered,
And
you had the switchback all the way up the
It
mountain.
works for flying.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Granted, like the Witch Kings changed how that, but there are so few of them.
Right. And they're like kind of like the, having that ability just to fly and to have those abilities, and that is like the thing, top tier.
Right. So yeah, it's so we were talking about it, like there's no setting book. The reason why I'm having this conversation is because we just played Burning Wheel, right? and there is no setting book for Burning Wheel.
Right. Ostensibly, there's no setting, but there is.
And it's so interesting that you can play this game. First off, and this is coming off of what you were saying, Sean, any game that has a life path system is very much informing its setting, much more than without, right? Mm-hmm. You could probably look at a cleric that was made in 10 published D&D settings, and they would be identical.
Like seeming on the page.
On the page,
like,
right? They may or may not be using feats or powers or whatever the case is, or spells or whatever that's available in other settings.
But even if they were using spells,
they would still be there. Your fighter would probably look identical in Ravenloft as it would in Dark Sun. Because
Dark Sun's kind of the odd one out, I feel like.
Actually, I was just thinking because
not for a fighter.
Well, but even with a wizard, where in Dark Sun they're generating the magic in a much different way with different consequences. D&D consequences, but you're still casting a fireball.
You're still casting Fireball. And those three, again, Dark Sun, Forgotten Realms. Forgotten Realms, you might have more stuff on your character sheet than you do in the other settings.
Right.
But by and large, you could have the exact same character throughout.
Yeah.
You can't... Once you make a Burning Wheel character, that Burning Wheel character is going to look very different than Wizards in other systems and other settings. In fact, even what it emulates those characters are going to look very different, right? So Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is going to be closer to a Burning Wheel character, or any of the various iterations of Tolkien.
Or Torchbearer would be something I think would be somewhat similar to Burning Wheel.
It's the same family, right?
Don't mention the impact of the setting, because I think it's playing in a character, and it allowed, I think, that shared theater of the mind to really have a lot of space to it. I wanted to mention on the flip side that it bothers me when there's no maps. Mm-hmm. I'd really, when we're playing RPGs, I've really became accustomed to
minis.
I'm not the mini. I'm talking a map of the setting, of the city, of the world. No, I'm talking about
the world.
Yeah, and just I'm tied to it.
Yeah.
In a way with my games, and when but I've found over the course of playing with you guys where you don't have that,
Well, for these one-offs.
For one-offs, Like when I'm playing, like if you're playing in the Witch Hunters game or whatever, it's like here's the map of the city, here's the map of the continent.
Same thing with my Burning Wheel game. That map is actually intrinsic to their ability to play.
Yeah, since we're doing one-offs for this, so it's kind of hard to have that sort of...
We're not going to...
The experiment that we're doing here of, playing through these systems and looking at the engagement of system and setting is it's been a really interesting process for me, and hopefully it has been for other people as well. But it's a funny thing because it's so different in some ways from what we do in our other games in terms of the setting element, because you can't bring in that much setting, or I can't anyways, in a one-shot, and that's, it's something
because we're focusing on system, we don't want to get into the lore. Like Trinity has this enormous amount of lore that I only gave you guys just a brief fraction.
Just enough to make a character, basically,
Twilight Imperium.
Right. Yeah, I got that sense,
game, right? Huge setting, but we're just going to get glimpses of those settings. But Interestingly enough, like we're going to, are you doing one of their campaign frames? Or are you going to make your own campaign frame for Daggerheart?
There was a campaign frame that I saw that I thought fit really well. But I now that you're talking about it the way you are, I'm wondering how stringent it will be compared to what I want to do. So I guess the answer is my own campaign frame. But might be able to apply almost everything to it. Again, I have a map in my mind, and I have the story in my mind. So the fact that I'm starting there, which is what normally would get me, what gets me excited about DMing a game, and is what going to get me further into the Daggerheart mechanics. But it's starting there, and I'm just curious how this is going to play out based off of this conversation in terms of how then are the mechanics going to either tie my hands or play into it or make the experience surprising. So all
right, so that's a really great segue into the last piece, which is how is setting affect mechanics, right? And I think when I say mechanics, like I'm also very focused on player behavior, but I want to, are there pieces of setting? What pieces of setting do you think are going to inform mechanics, that are going to inform the way the game is played?
Well, I'm thinking about blades a bit in terms of the degree that the system is integrated with the setting, but I don't know if that's necessarily what you're talking about.
Right. If we're doing you could kind of see that. I see where you're going with that, because Blades is focused on the crew.
Right.
And we have seen several iterations of Blades in the Dark, of Forged in the Dark games, that aren't focused on the crew. And what does that do to the game?
I haven't played any like that.
Well, Echoes doesn't really have a crew sheet.
That's true. Yeah. Okay.
And it is interesting how intrinsic the crew is.
Oh, I do have one, which is, I have to give a little bit of backstory for the listeners, which is that we've been doing something where we started playing with Otherscape, in a setting, and played a number of sessions. I think at least
6 months.
Yeah, 6 months. There's a bunch of sessions, and then for a variety of reasons, we changed over to a Forged in the Dark adaptation of Shadowrun. And, it was interesting seeing, basically in the same setting with the same characters, how different it felt in some ways by just changing the system that we're using.
Why we felt like we had to, right? Because as much as I liked Otherscape, and I have to say that because the sheer amount of money that I spent on it, as much as I love Otherscape and the Mist Engine games, it didn't feel like Cyberpunk.
Yeah.
We're very entrenched in Cyberpunk. We love the Cyberpunk ideology and thoughts and so on and so forth, and felt like Otherscape was a superhero game. And hard.
I also struggle with games where there's no hierarchy at all, where it's just tags. It's like if they had tags and then 3 other category attributes and tags or something else to hold on to. But making it all tags made it was harder for me to wrap my head around that. 4 tags I'm applying to this thing, and I have 5 tags I'm applying to this, and 3, and it's just kind of was
so flat.
Right, exactly. That's
so that's a piece where the system was not meeting the needs of the setting,
right?
In my opinion, I didn't feel. I get what you're saying. I just didn't feel like it felt like Cyberpunk.
Yeah, no, I got that too.
And where Runners in the Dark, I feel like feels much more like Cyberpunk. And Cyber plus Punk feels very Cyberpunk.
Sort of grittiness of it, and it kind of forcing you to have that struggle through it in a way, whereas and one element, some very little things sometimes do it too, where it's there not being an intrinsic money system, where it's I understand. Certainly I'm not a fan of nickel and diming fantasy money, but if you're like, you know, the sort of struggling freelancer, it's a big factor on decisions you make and what, you know, why you're doing things that maybe are ethically challenging for you as a runner, whatever it is, you know, like that's a part of the cyberpunk setting. And if we don't have that, it's kind of,
That's actually interesting. It goes into the next piece that I think is really informed story is economy and gold pieces. I think it really changes a game when you're tracking gold pieces. I think that's such an intrinsic, and you don't really think of it as mechanics, but it's like...
I mean, in some versions of D&D, it's experience, so it's a double incentive for it, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
I always wanted to do a real-time money thing.
Of course you have.
Right. But I've always wanted to like give them bags of coins, you know, and be like, here you go, there's an exchange system, you know. I mean, I use coins for a lot of things. I think they're really fun. Whenever I see coins in a fucking Kickstarter for a game, I'm like, all right, I'm going to buy into that. You know, Torchbearer has coins we didn't really get to use.
Right.
And, so there's a bunch of different games that have coins. It's so much fun. There's just such a visceral feeling to having...
It's a hard enough time having my players keep track of the weight of the coins that they're actually physically carrying.
Right, but I mean, do you need to do that? That's true, but like... I only do wealth systems now. I only do resource systems. But if I was to do that, I always have them automatically be able to switch out platinum for coppers, like, you know what I mean, kind of idea.
You gotta have realism. You gotta make them carry as many real coins as their character has.
Right. I totally want to do that.
All right, you got 1,000 gold pieces. Here you go. Carry it on.
You know, it makes you wonder, like, how much would they haggle? How much would they be like want more money?
Yeah.
If they actually be like, you know, we're going to give you 5 gold. That's great. 5 gold's fantastic. We don't want any more than that.
On the setting side of it, I mean, certainly, you know, you were talking about walls in D&D. Not like this should be the picking on D&D session, but it gives a lot of good examples. You know, like economy in D&D, right? Like you have all these adventurers running out, bringing back sacks full of gold, if that's, you know, a thing that's happening, even a fair amount in the game, and how's that going to affect the local economy?
Right.
You know, alternately, we've joked in a lot of past games, like after you've had your big break as an adventurer, like wouldn't it make sense for you to instead of continuing to like do this life-threatening thing to like become a merchant? You know,
pull up someone.
Well, and also I want to point
it's a motivation thing.
Here's a really good example of how setting definitely has affected mechanics, because I can tell you 100% that rules have been made in terms of like the value and prices of things that can be crafted specifically for that reason.
Right.
That they go, okay, wait a minute, we know they're going to get a shit ton of money. We have to keep this game about adventuring. We can't have it be about them turning into magic item salesmen.
Right.
Which is what it would become if they didn't change the way that stuff worked. And if you really think about it, like, I don't know, maybe that might be an interesting game that I have to run at some point in time. But if you think about it, like, they always make that process very hard.
Torchbearer does it by making it really hard to bring your stuff back, that's part of what it is. Like they really up it in terms of like you're not counting the weight of your gold so much as like what pouch are you putting those in, or like what, you know, well now you can't put anything else there, you know, like it's very
well, right. I love that economy. I've always wanted to like have an inventory slot map and have cutouts. I've actually done this for games and have cutouts of items, and then like all right, well, this is where I'm going to put this, just like old school, like Diablo. You know, this is where I'm going to put it. This is how big it is. Oh crap, I have to switch this out. You know, that I've always wanted to do.
I have a funny internal argument about it because I on the one hand, I really appreciate the way it affects the decisions you make as a player, and kind of will drive you away from becoming like the merchant or whatever. But on the other hand, like as the narrative side of sort of what drives me to play these games, like I'm like, I don't care. Where it's like I don't care how many gold people, unless if it really matters for the character of the story. Like it's like I have this constant like mental tension there where it's like, I don't want to keep track of like all the pouches of my body. I don't, but
that's an interesting separation from setting and story.
Yeah.
Right. Is because like there's a reason why we don't go to the bathroom in RPGs
right.
unless it's a part of the story.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I hate shopping in Dungeons & Dragons. Absolutely fucking hate it. I like going through the books and picking stuff, but I don't want to do it at the table.
Unless if there's like part of that encounter that
matters. Or you're role-playing the merchant.
Or you're role-playing the merchant.
No, I'm saying that's added time then.
But I'll tell you, when I'm a GM, because I'm a dick, when I'm a GM, I'm like, nope, here you go. He rolls it out in front of you. This is the stuff he has.
Right. That or it becomes an encounter and we're like, oh no, something's going to happen.
Right.
There's a reason why this merchant's talking to me.
His name is Isaac. Oh shit. He's got a name.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That means he has levels. Fuck.
There's something going on here. I don't trust this guy.
Well, just one other point on money. I can attest definitely to the idea that, like, on the one hand, I'll just give my player characters a bag of holding, and all the stuff that you're talking about, is just like, it becomes to the point where getting the treasure isn't any more motivation for anything very quickly.
Right.
But on the other hand, I've played, my brother's games. He likes survival and very much keeps track of not only the gold, but limits the goal to sort of what would be real in struggling 10 towns, right? And then also makes me as a wizard pay for my material components.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Like I got, find familiar, but then I had to go like get a $200 brass brazier in a frozen wasteland in order to use the goddamn spell.
I love it.
It has an impact on setting, without a doubt.
Yeah,
it does. Without a doubt.
It does. And, I don't like, it's just a personal preference. Lots of people who play Forgotten Realms and love it and why they love it. And that's great. But that's one of the reasons I don't like Forgotten Realms. It's like it becomes so much about stuff. That's why I stopped playing WoW. It's like grinding for specific equipment,
right?
And
there's always the bigger and better piece that you grind for, and then you hit that certain point where the dopamine just doesn't turn on anymore.
Right?
What am I doing with my life?
But what is your game about? Becomes a really interesting question, because then it's like, well, wait a minute, is this about shopping? Is it about managing coin? That could be an interesting game, but fuck if it's not a different game than Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, it's just not what I'm playing D&D for. Okay, y'all are going to argue that I'm not playing D&D, but...
Although I think it's funny that, D&D game that I DM for you, I let you play an Illithid controller, given your proclivities as a player. It's like, yeah, sure, fine, you can be an Illithid, go for it. Let's see how this goes. It wasn't as much of a disaster as I thought it would be, honestly. But
I thought it was great. I thought it was fun. Especially that time that I commanded the dragon to jump off of a cliff and not fly. I don't want to fight that thing.
Yeah, and it actually works. Made a critical fail, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. But and so it's funny too, because you have to really be in the mood to engage with some of that stuff. Like, you have to have buy-in, because look how much you guys struggled over Torchbearer. Like, I, as the GM, was having a blast.
I enjoyed it. It was just, it was like,
you guys were like, I don't want the slog. I don't like this,
Yeah, it was, Like, it was weird though, because it was like, I really appreciated what they were doing as designer and what you were doing as storyteller. And I got it and enjoyed that part of it, but at the same time, I also hated it. And so it's sort of like, I don't know how I feel about that. Right, exactly.
The mechanics are so constraining.
Now I'm angry.
Right?
Now I'm hungry.
Which is so funny because it's like, these are emotions that most game designers are trying to avoid, you know,
Right.
and Luke and Thor have managed to embrace them.
Yeah.
But I love that as a player and as a GM. I love that struggle. Looking at Burning Wheel, here's another like mechanics meets setting. Looking at Burning Wheel obstacles, they're very high.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah.
So like, think about this for a second. You've just bought the persuasion skill. You opened it up at 2 dice, right? And maybe you spent a lot of your points and put it 2 more up. You have 4 dice in persuasion. Now that means you have a 4 will. So if you are facing anyone else with just a persuasion roll, your obstacle to persuade them to do anything is 4. It's equal to their will. So you're rolling 4 dice and expecting just base fucking stock standard average to roll 4 successes to be able to persuade anybody to do anything.
Yeah.
Now that's because they want help. They want you to fork things in. Like,
Yeah.
and even so, okay, I just got to 6 dice. I have to get 4 successes on 6 dice.
Right. That's still, yeah.
Oof. Right? So it's meant to be hard. It's meant to be like, all right, we're fighting for this.
Well, yeah. How easy is it to persuade somebody? You know what I mean? Like even, walking to a store and trying to persuade somebody to give you a better price on like,
right.
right,
because
your pizza.
players like our buddy, right? Our buddy was like their first big challenge was facing a hill giant. Like, I'm gonna ask him to join our party. They're like, nope.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna convince him that I'm cooler than he
And it
is.
actually worked.
And it worked.
I got a 5% chance.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. That's why you'll notice D&D social rules, and a lot of people don't engage with the D&D social rules. There are really significant social rules in there. I don't know if you guys know this, but there's actually and part of the social rules, which is interesting, is it starts with, can this person be swayed?
Right.
It starts with either I'm not certain, they're friendly or they're hostile. Like they're agreeable, they're neutral, or they're not agreeable. If they're agreeable, why roll? They're just going to do what you ask.
I think a lot of people run it like Baldur's Gate 3, where it's just like, it might be a hard roll, but you can roll a 20 and convince the demon to kill himself, or whatever. Right. So,
but in the rules, if there's the GM, it's very arbitrary. If they wouldn't do that thing, you can't convince them to do that thing.
Right.
You can't. There's no rule in there. What you have to do is you could convince them to be more friendly towards you, and thus maybe making them more towards agreeable or more towards undecided. Once they get into that undecided range, now you can start using persuasion, use social skills. Which I think is very interesting because I don't know that a lot of people know that about Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. I mean, there are rules like that in Chronicles of Darkness too, which are kind of very cool, but also I find don't get engaged with that often. And part of it is because it starts to feel, start to feel a little bit like a slog in terms of the rest of the group, especially one character who's like the social character, and and it's like, okay, now we're gonna have this whole encounter with all these sort of things where you're trying to slowly move them towards something, and everyone else is kind of twiddling their thumbs.
Well, that's what I was thinking when you mentioned that. The D&D rules for social encounters. I'm like, that's the face. Right. That's the one character that really wants to engage with everybody else is waiting. Yeah. Because they're mainly charisma rolls.
Which is great, like it's their moment, but it also can be sort of a thing where it kind of splits them off from the rest of the party in terms of situations where they can do anything and feel like they're engaging,
Well, and part of that is also, like, if you think about it, D&D is about combat. Like, most of your abilities, most of the rules,
most of the rule books certainly are.
It's about fighting monsters.
And also, you're very heroic and very hard to kill, and you can get raised easily. Of course, we want to do the exciting shit, right? But something like Torchbearer, Burning Wheel, you don't want to get into a fight,
right?
The game I'm running is specifically a bunch of desperate fools who are out to gain power and glory. And to do so, they're going to fight monsters.
And they're probably going to die.
Every single session, they're going to fight monsters. And it's interesting because in Burning Wheel, fighting is your last resort. Like, you have failed if you're fighting something. And so everything is done through negotiation, through sneaking. Like, you know, you're never going to get into a face-to-face fight, you know, which is really funny because it's sort of, it is, talk about setting, meeting mechanics. That's the real world bleeding into the mechanics because in many, many situations, Lucas outright like abhors violence, you know, and thinks it is the last resort of fools, which is exactly what Burning Wheel.
Well, that's fine. I mean, you know, I as a fan of Lord of the Rings, like, you know, got into fantasy sort of by way of that early on, as many people did. Like, I feel that very strongly in Burning Wheel. Like, I mean, obviously we're talking about in terms of like creating elf characters, you get that sense, but just also like it's not a world in which most of the characters, unless if, you know, you're quote unquote evil. We can talk about the morality of the Lord of the Rings. That's a whole other conversation. But combat is your last resort. Even if you're like, you know, like a wizard, you still want to, you know, Gandalf is trying to get them out of fights. He's, you know, calling in the eagles to get the hell out of there.
Gandalf is a high-level NPC that is there to
save the party,
the rest of the party, because they want to create this illusion of lethality, right, and of mortality. That's why you have, I forget what they're called. Again, you can shout at the you know, whatever you're listening this through. That's why they're the special kind of angel wizard that they
Maiar, I think.
Yeah, I think so. That they are is because they're immortal, they're powerful. It's really the only real source of magic, you know, are the caveat, you know. They're the hand to be like, okay, well, you guys survived, right? Gandalf letting you survive, but now because you did so poorly on all your rolls, you don't get Gandalf until later in the adventure.
Right. He has to go off and do other wizard shit. Don't worry about it.
You know, and get this dramatic moment of Gandalf the White showing up. You know. So anything else? I think, you know, we have maps are a thing that you started us off with in this, and like I think maps are a really important part of, like, once you have a map. Impersonally, I feel like you need to understand modes of travel. Like, you have to have mechanics that explain to you how long it's going to take to get from A to B.
I mean, when I started playing D&D, then would be drawing a map and looking at it and just asking questions. I mean, like, okay, there's hills here, there's a river here, you know, who's here? And you start asking questions about what's going on the map and kind of pre-build that way. And then once you're playing the game, you're basically just doing that too. I think a map, is a very important part of the setting,
and even the maps that come with the module or whatever, there's the spaces in between, you know, and what you're doing on the way. So
this is an interesting question of, like, which is which? And I guess it really depends on the designer. Do you feel like hex crawls was mechanics informing setting? Or do you think hex crawls are setting informing mechanics?
Oh, man.
I feel like it's setting informing mechanics.
I feel like there's a question on a test.
You know, every designer is going to be different, because some designers are going to be like, I want to design a hex crawl, right? Like, that's a different animal.
Yeah.
But I think they got created from looking at that Greyhawk hex map.
Right.
Because that Greyhawk hex map, very famous, came with the Greyhawk box set. That was created well before the hex crawl existed. And I feel like people wanted to have mechanics.
Right. How do you engage with it? That's not just you start walking, you sleep, you get there.
Yeah.
Right.
How far is this?
Yeah.
A lot of games are narrative, right? A lot of games are like, all right, well, you travel for a couple of days and you get there to this place.
Sure.
And you go. And I think that's how we most of the time do.
And that's one of those huge powers, that secret powers that a GM has, is that you can make the difference between walking between two rooms or walking between two different countries
Exactly.
be the same like amount on the the quote unquote page, or like narrating it to people, or it can be the entire campaign. I mean, I don't know how you'd make it walking from one room to the other whole campaign, but you could probably do it.
It's also keeping track of every minute of every day versus something that you guys introduced me to was scenes.
Right.
I mean, just the idea that, okay, cut, we're done this part, however much time has gone by.
Right, and a scene is a kind of a nebulous amount of time.
You've traveled and time has gone by, and now you're in this new spot where a lot of time, most of the times that I've ever played, it's you start and then what's happening minute by minute, day by day. Right. And, and if it's downtime, it's downtime, but you're accounting for it,
Downtime is such a big game changer in terms of setting. And I think
we'll definitely have an episode just on that, I'm sure.
Just downtime, but right. But I think that like it really has allowed us during our games to explore the setting, yet still keep games very tight.
Yeah. And you can engage systems into it, so it's not just sort of that idea of like, okay, you have fighty, and then you have the role play, and the role play is really just your characters talking to each other, but nothing really happens. Whereas in downtime, there are actions you can take, there are things that happen. Still, it's not just your characters. I mean, it could be, but it doesn't. It's not always just your characters like sitting in a bar and being like shooting the shit.
And there are stakes, right? Like again, terrible player, just for anybody's sake. Somebody asked me the other day, like, do you play or do you GM? And I was like, well, I really like GMing, but also I'm a bad player. It's not fun to play with. But like, I get bored to tears just talky scenes. I get bored to tears being like blah 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 blah. And like, I'm a story guy, but like, and I wanna perform and things like that. But it's like, okay, just can we get to it? Let's do it.
Well, because that talkie isn't necessarily story. It's like, and I think it comes from the idea that narrative is a sort of fluff or sort of flavor text that you throw in, as opposed to the very thing that's driving characters to do whatever they're doing.
It's exposition, right? So that can be a big part of what's happening there,
right?
Or just
But I think. And I think King would agree with me. Like, less is more when it comes to dialogue.
Somewhat. Although when you're playing, there is a blowing off steam element both for the characters and for the players. And so, I do try to allow a certain amount of it and not like just constantly drive people, because that can...
Oh, no, absolutely. But like, for instance, this is something that I noticed. If you guys listen to our stream, you'll notice my Duel of Wits. Every action you take is generally a sentence. Right, in Duel of Wits. So if you have a point to make, it's just a sentence in your point. If you're doing a rebuttal, well, except blah 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 blah, and it's that fast. I listen to other streams doing and actual plays doing Duel of Wits, and they have people's points. They're doing whole fucking paragraphs. Like they're standing on soapboxes and like doing their whole thing, and I have no patience for that. Like, I played in those games, like, all right, let's like move forward, like, because it takes away from some of the mechanical piece, And I learned this from Dogs in the Vineyard. When we guys played Dogs in the Vineyard, should be a natural conversation going back and forth. I put dice forward. It's like a little bid system. I put dice forward. You have to match that. So I say a sentence, and then you say a sentence. Only yours is informed by whether or not yours beats mine or not. And then I say a sentence. You say a sentence until we're like, all right, fine. And then like you agree that like my point, or I agree to your point, kind of idea.
Okay.
There's like a back and forth. The same thing with the Duel of Wits. I want our scenes to have a point. And so...
I agree with that. I think I have a little more patience than you as a player for that, but I do get it.
100%. And I don't mind, like, and role-playing scenes are important. Very important. Burning Empires has entire scenes called interstitial scenes, which are literally just designed for two people.
I mean, if you ever watch a movie, a lot of movies... Marvel movies started pulling this out, and you started seeing it. Like, one of the things that worked with Marvel movies early on is they would use the formula of like, you have the exposition scene, you have the combat scene, you have and there's sort of like tension and release. Whereas it became like just this is a 3-hour fight scene, and like you don't get any of that release, and you start to zone out, even though it's like boom, 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 but you're not pulled into it anymore. And RPGs work the same way.
Yeah, I agree. There still has to be. I've said this many times. Like Mike Pondsmith's Cyberpunk Red, as trite as it seems, is a brilliant mechanic for scenes of. Fight scene, not fight scene. Fight scene, not fight scene.
Yeah.
Just like conflict, not conflict. Conflict, not conflict. Go up and down. It doesn't have to be, and it works surprisingly well.
Yeah, like most of the time, I'm pretty usually resistant to prescriptivism, so I'd be like not 100% of the time, but definitely if you use it like 90% of the time, just on and off, it works. Yeah, lots of food for thought.
I think some of the games we played recently, Ronin, right, has honor, and that's intrinsic to the setting. When you have games, Sanity for Call of Cthulhu, right, is intrinsic to the setting. Like these are all, again, we talk a lot about subsystems. Daggerheart campaign frames becomes just these little subsystems, ways that you can really inform. Makes your world different, makes your world that one like different thing, one unique idea, and can really change. You hope the goal is to have players think a little differently, to make decisions a little differently in your narrative.
Building the characters can also do that, like building the characters and forming the setting. As,
Right.
Opposed to putting stats together, gotten to see that with some of these.
Yeah, with Burning Wheel, definitely got that from the character creation process of like, I know this character before we started playing more than, a lot of RPGs. It's a discovery process, and sometimes it can take a little while where you're like, you get the sort of cardboard cutout of the character right away, but,
That's interesting, right? Because you look at a character sheet. I want us to do this one of these days. I want us to like look at 10 character sheets. Seriously, and be like, okay, what am I getting out of this character? Now, we're all creative types, right? So we're going to look at it and we're going to say, oh, I can already see where this character might go, who they are. But I think some systems, some mechanics lean into, once you look at character sheet, you actually are informed.
Well, it tells you, when it tells you something about their motivations and where they've been and where they're going.
Motivations are a big part of it. I think goals, beliefs, beliefs, goals, arcs, whatever you want to call them, a huge piece. We're going to probably do a whole thing on that, on those. Life paths, understanding where the character has been, that's a big part of
right. And I do like having capabilities and systems too. I mean, that's kind of maybe where we vary somewhat, but like still, it's still kind of what those capabilities, to the extent that they are engaged with in the rules. Like if someone is a juggler or whatever, like that factors into what they can do in the world. And that factors maybe into what they're interested in or whatever, but it's not like something where I want to trace every single thing that they're juggling,
Well, there's a common parlance in story games is that a character sheet is a love letter to a GM. To
right.
say, like, this is telling a GM what I want
that was
to
my backstory.
Do in the game. Well, and this is interesting, right? Because what the things we're talking about, you guys didn't need to write backstories to the Burning Wheel characters.
Right. We kind of did by doing the life path or whatever.
And your session zeros, right? Where I think a lot of other games, you kind of do need backstories. You kind of do need to write these things. I thought it was weird in Ember that you made these really complex characters, but then it had like 3 boxes at the end that said, write your goals. Right. Like it wasn't like
sort of tacked on.
It just tacked on. In fact, it was just in notes. It wasn't like, oh, here's the character goals. No, in notes, tell us who you are.
And that's kind of how it's a lot of times how it's handled. And there's even a whole discourse about like, backstories aren't necessary and like kind of like a waste of time. Yeah, and I guess that is playing into what we were talking about earlier of like some people who are playing it, in a certain play style where it is much more about just the roles on, and like exploring the dungeon or whatever, and like the character is kind of replaceable in a way. But I mean, even when I'm playing those sort of games, it's like hard for me to get away from caring about the character.
As a player, I just need that in order to provide that extra motivation,
a connection to the character,
to the character. One thing we haven't touched on yet, and I think I want us now to touch on in a separate session, is alignment.
Oh yeah, no, we should have a conversation about that.
There. So we could probably take alignment and any kind of sort of politic or factions and other aspects to characters.
Sure.
Like even some of the ones we've talked about with Burning Wheel, where some of that it makes assumptions about the characters, they're.
I mean, alignment's a good example of something that ties into the setting. We should definitely we're going to have a conversation about it with no episode.
We're all, you've already run D&D. We're going to run D&D. I say we do an alignment conversation after we
definitely
do our D&D games to see how each of us, and I think we should just have a whole conversation just on that, because I think
definitely.
I think
alignment and moral compass too. I'm not just talking about the mechanic of alignment, which is very specific for D&D.
Moral ethics.
But I'm thinking about this with the cyberpunk, right? Like that was something that I had to wrap my head around, in a sense of the cops are always the bad guy. You know what I mean? And that's just sort of baked into the setting.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely. Cyberpunk's a huge piece where, like we talked about before, setting definitely needs to inform your mechanics, because as we saw, Otherscape wasn't really meeting our needs, right? Hero is probably not going to meet our needs. It's just it's a superhero game.
Right.
And superhero games don't have the same drudgery.
Right. I mean, you can have a superhero game where characters have cyberware and it's aesthetically a cyberpunk campaign.
Hero has a rule set called Cyberhero.
Right. There you go.
And if good GMs, right, can bring that across, but the mechanics are not really going to help
reinforce it. Yeah.
Really. Cool.
Yeah, cool. That's a good conversation. And
excited about those future conversations too, right?
You have been listening to another episode of the Modern Mythology podcast. We hope we gave you something new to think about that you can bring to your RPGs, writing, and other character-based games and art forms. Produced by James Kershaw. Soundtrack by Scott Landis and James Kershaw. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net.